this, as I say, intense frustration, that sort of the real sense that there's no more legitimacy with this government, with this regime, whether that leads to changes inside the system, inside the regime, changes in the balance of power between the people who want to just double down with hardline views and opposition to the West, and those who'd like to do things differently. And also whether these protests can actually win some control back in the way that the hijab protests effectively forced the government to back away from imposing the hijab law.
On yesterday morning's programme, we reported on some of the protests that have spread across Iran. Those protests seem to be building. They started with complaints about the spiralling inflation, but yesterday university students and others joined, with the dissent seeming to widen and to deepen. Just how much of a challenge could these be to the Iranian regime? Rob Macaire is a former British ambassador to Iran, and he joins us now. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning.
Rob, how do you interpret these protests, which seemingly are not dwindling, they're actually widening and deepening? How worried should the regime be now?
Well, these are the biggest protests that we've seen in Iran since the major protests of 2022, which was the Women, Life, Freedom movement, which was a very courageous set of protests, which everyone will remember. Those were about the hijab, essentially, and about social freedoms, and they were more political. These are essentially economically driven protests, but what all of these waves of protests do is demonstrate an overall feeling of frustration about the regime. And this is not new. We've seen it in protests in 2017, protests in 2019, 2020, when I was living there. But these are, I'd say, very significant, and as you say, they seem to be continuing, and they've spread from small traders who are particularly affected by the collapse of the currency to university students who are always a good source of protest, and then more broadly in the country. So they're happening in cities across Iran, and they are significant.
And there's an interesting quote here from an Iranian expert who grew up under the regime, Beni Sabti, who said when the very poor people from the provinces go out to protest, it doesn't have a real effect in the country. But when it's in Tehran, and not just the lower classes, but also the middle class, which is the bazaar and upwards, and the students, that is the lethal combination that the regime is scared of. And it does seem it's gathering momentum amongst those groups, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I think we have to be realistic about what this could lead to, because it is significant. But the regime still has control over all the levers of power. It has the armed force. It has a very large militia in the Basij who can come out on the streets and exert any amount of force. And they've shown their willingness. The regime's shown its willingness to do that in the past. And there isn't an organizer in these protests. There isn't a leadership either inside or outside the country that people can rally around. So the idea that this might lead to these protests overthrowing the regime, which some people are talking about, sadly, I think is unrealistic. I think rather we should be thinking about it as whether this as I say, intense frustration, that sort of the real sense that there's no more legitimacy with this government, with this regime, whether that leads to changes inside the system, inside the regime, changes in the balance of power between the people who want to just double down with hardline views and opposition to the West, and those who'd like to do things differently. And also whether these protests can actually win some control back in the way that the hijab protests effectively forced the government to back away from imposing the hijab law.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you read reports from inside Tehran now. There are reports of many people wandering around without hijabs, and that actually it doesn't look like Tehran looked several years ago. That this movement has actually made a profound difference for women. I do want to ask you about how regime change would work from inside. We don't get much information about the inner workings of the politics in Iran. Are there significant groups then jostling for change within this regime?
There's always been a tension inside the regime between the very hardline ideological and military side of the regime, which tends to be closer and more aligned with the supreme leader, and those politicians who are still loyal to the regime. They still want to maintain the Islamic Republic, but they think that it could be run differently. That reformist wing has been essentially discredited time and time again, because each time they have won elections, and they do tend to win when the people are given a vote and are given a choice. They tend to vote for non-regime candidates or non-hardline candidates. But they have never delivered the economic progress that they've promised. And you have a sense now, this current government, that Pezeshkian, the president, who does come from that reformist wing, but there's really a sense that he doesn't know what to do, and that the government as a whole, the system as a whole, doesn't know what to do. They introduced this big package. Central bank had a big package to stabilize the currency before Christmas back in early December, and of course that completely failed. So it's a sense of the government, it's this mismanagement I think people are angry about.
Well, the head of Iran's central bank resigning won't help as a sort of symbol of economic stability, will it, at a time like this? But I know you were saying that the current leader, Pezeshkian, he's saying that he's willing to meet with representatives of the protesters, something that activists are interpreting as a positive sign right now, and something they haven't really done before. Do you see that as a positive sign and as progress?
I think if you look at all of the protests that have been, and they happen every year or two, as I say, whenever something serious has happened, the government has tended to meet it both with force and with an attempt to try to appease those protests. Like any autocratic, dictatorial system, they don't know how complete their grip on power is. And I think people in the system are probably perpetually scared of what might happen. So they do try to appease the demands that people have. It's very difficult to see where they go though, because people are angry not just about the currency collapsing and the real impact on cost of living and the inflationary costs inside Iran, which have been bad for years, but really bad this year. But it's also, the environmental mismanagement. It's the fact that the water is drying up. In Tehran, there is massive air pollution, partly because they're burning cheaper, lower quality fuel oil, and it's the sense that the government is just not delivering anything for the people, and there's no hope of it getting better.
Away from the protests, before I let you go, I do want to ask about Trump's comments. Iran has promised to respond very harshly to any aggression after Donald Trump threatened further military action, or at least certainly gave the red light to Israel if they wanted to make further strikes against Iran. Is his commentary inflaming tensions further right now?
Well, you have to look at the fact that he was speaking just after a meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So these comments didn't come out of the blue. They were in relation to the meeting he'd had with the Israeli Prime Minister. I think a lot of people would say it's the prospect for further military action against Iran by Israel and or America is far from remote. And the what we'd all like to see is some serious talks underway to end up with a stable, peaceful settlement that could actually stabilize the region. That seems quite a long way off at the moment, but it's no surprise at all that both from Israel and from the US there's a lot of saber rattling, and no surprise that Iran is responding by saying, if you attack us, we will do far more than we did last time around, and we're still able to defend ourselves.
Thank you very much for your time this morning. We appreciate you and your insights. That is Rob Macaire, who is the former British ambassador to Iran.